for more discussion on the Eastern Economic Forum and the relations, the latest development between China and Russia. We are joined in our Beijing studio Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business here in Beijing. In Moscow, we have Professor Alexander Lukin, Director of East Asian and SCO Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Also joining us in Moscow from Russia, Viktor Olevich. He is a political analyst and also lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Let me go to you first, Professor Lukin. What do you make of the really warm, apparently, relations between China and Russia? After all, 3 meetings already this year between the heads of states. What does it say? Is it just between the two countries or sending signals to the others? Professor Lukin.
Well, the improvement and normalization of Russian-Chinese relations and then virtual rapprochement began long ago, more than 2 decades ago. And despite the fact that leaders changed and even in Russia social system changed, the improvement and coming together between Russia and China has not changed, which means it's an objective political process. But of course at that moment the United States very much helps us to come together, because it began, especially under Trump, pressing both Russia and China at the same time. And it of course makes the necessity of coordination even more important. This is kind of the geopolitical basis for it. But I think that the fact that Mr. Xi Jinping came to Vladivostok is important not only because of that, but because he probably wanted to stress that China can contribute to the development of the Russian Far East. And this is a strategically important goal of Russian policy.
Is the United States apparently, Professor Liu from Beijing, pushing China and Russia ever much closer toward one another? Russia is under sanction coming from the so-called Western countries, and China certainly in an apparent trade war with the United States, likely to be more escalations.
Yes. You know, during the national security strategy crafted under the Trump administration, China and Russia are named as revisionist countries, adversaries to the United States. So we normally say nothing unites but a common enemy. So now there is a strong impetus for China and Russia to work together. And aside from that, there is really intrinsic rationale for China and Russia to work together, given the structural complementarity in its economy, and also given the strong ambition of the two state leaders to renovate and also innovate its national economy and to create themselves as the greatest countries.
See, Mr. Olevich, of course, it was the United States earlier in its strategic papers talking about China and Russia as their so-called big nation competitors, and named China and Russia in a very negative way in many of the policy papers. But the question is whether China and Russia want to really go onto that road, which has been, in a way, designed by the United States.
Well, we can look at the way that the Russian-Chinese relations have been developing since the end of the Cold War. And as my colleague had said, the rapprochement began in the late 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev was the head of the Soviet Union. And then the relationship was cemented further when the United States became the sole superpower after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, in the situation in the unipolar world where Washington saw an opportunity to dictate its will on everyone else, Both Moscow and Beijing saw themselves as the victimized parties, as the less influential parties that could increase their influence in international relations by increasing cooperation, both political cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, and also economic cooperation, which is what we are seeing today. It is not accidental that the importance of the Vladivostok Economic Forum increased. In fact, it was instituted 4 years ago, when the major economic sanctions against Russia were initiated by Washington and its Western allies.
Well, but
of course, Russia at that time.
But Mr. Elevich, you know, there is a huge difference between the way that China and Russia act now in order to quote-unquote balance with quote-unquote compete against. So my question to you is exactly what China and Russia, if put together or if talked about separately, they're to balance that of the United States or to compete against the United States, which has been the latter one, the description coming from the U.S. originally in their policy papers, terming China and Russia as the so-called big nation competitors.
Of course, for the American foreign policy establishment, which is used to having a leading role in international relations for the past quarter century, both Russia and China and some other powers like Iran are seen as geopolitical competitors. But in Moscow and in Beijing, we see it as a balancing act, essentially as an act in transition from Pax Americana, from the unipolar American world, to a multipolar world, where it will not just Washington will play a part in constructing the architecture of future international relations, of the future international system, but also Beijing and Moscow and other capitals of world powers will play a role in constructing that political, economic, and other aspects of our common future.
Oh, say,
and,
Mr. Putin, Mr. Lukin, may I ask Professor Mr. Lukin, can you help us to understand if it is an act in transition? It is real, actual economic and social bounds that have put these countries together. Will the economic and real interactions really catch up with the political, in a way, common ground? That actually has been a question being asked for a long time between China and Russia and about the potential of this relationship. Professor Lukin.
Well, both. But first I want to say that I don't entirely agree with another colleague who said that we are uniting against an enemy. I would call the current situation as unilateral Cold War. It's the United States who sees us as enemy, both China and Russia. We don't see the United States as enemy. In Russia, we see the United States as kind of a country that has gone crazy. You know, it's run by a delusional elite. But we wish them well. We wish the American people to have a better government. It's a bit like situation during the Soviet Union, but we changed places. American is an ideologically run country, and we are very pragmatic. So from that point of view, when we are talking about Russian-Chinese relations, I would say that at the beginning the main reason for our cooperation was more geopolitical than economic. For example, American trade with China is like 7 or 8 times larger than China's trade with Russia. Also, China is the first Russia's partner, trading partner. But then it came to economic necessity as well, and the United States helped us a lot. For example, just a few days ago, China announced that as a countermeasure against American measures, it's not going to buy American soybeans. And Russia has soybeans. And one of the questions that is discussed at the forum, Vladivostok forum now, is that China is going to invest into the soybeans programs, agricultural development in the Russian Far East. So you know that the United States itself is moving Russia and China closer together, not only politically but also economically.
Okay, Professor Liu, let me ask you about that, about this economic incentive in a way put forward by Washington to make China and Russia come ever closer. We understand 1,000-strong business delegation is accompanying the Chinese President Xi Jinping to this forum, and enormous amount of contracts have been signed. We see, Professor Liu, there are several platforms that Russia and China have been working on together. Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is one of them, while Russia is having its own version, which is so-called the Far East, as they say, to develop the Far East. So how do you see the real underground projects really taking place? There has been concern whether those have been talked about will really be implemented, and whether those implemented will eventually see the final result. Those have been questions being raised about economic relations between China and Russia for some years. So, Professor Liu, is this time going to be different?
Well, for the last 2 decades, both of those leaders have demonstrated a great vision that there is good reason that we can work together. But so far, it is still the gas and oil that plays the most important role in China-Russia trade. And now, situation is getting different with deepened globalization and also deepened regional integration. More and more of the Chinese businesses, aside from those gigantic state-owned firms, the private firms, particularly in terms of the electronics, the manufacturing, machine tools, are really riveting the Russia as an important marketplace and supported by the e-commerce. And now we see that more and more Chinese investors are really highly interested in developing the agricultural programs in the Far East. And now there are serious plans to move on that.
I see.
But what they really desire would be a better consistency of the policy from Russia, and also a rule of law and even dispute settlement mechanism can be in place so that they have better assurance of what they can really achieve along the way.
Mr. Olovich, of course, some of those points mentioned by Professor Liu from Beijing is very important to the Chinese investors.
Well, of course, the Russian Far East, which is one of the most problematic regions in Russia from an economic standpoint, is an area of great interest for the Chinese business, for Chinese industrial managers, leaders. And in this way, Russia offers also a market for Chinese goods, and also there is a good perspective for cooperation on significant projects in the transportation sphere, and not just, by the way, not just in the Far East. There is still a discussion on the construction of a high-speed railway in the European part of Russia, in the Urals, where China is set to become a significant investor. And there are other projects in the energy sphere, of course, which is very important, both to Russia as an exporter of energy goods, and for China as a major importer. And there are projects also in agriculture and in fishing, in other areas of common interest, both for Moscow and for Beijing. I also want to stress that the economic forum, the current economic forum in Vladivostok this year, has more participants than the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which usually was more important. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was more focused on the West, more focused on Europe, on relations with Russia's partners to the West. But today, and in the last 4 years, Russia has made a sustained effort to gain access to improve relations, economic relations, with its eastern neighbors, China, South Korea, Mongolia, Japan, Vietnam, nations in Southeast Asia. And what we are seeing today in Vladivostok
and of course we have seen quite some
success.
interactions. I have to talk over you in order to introduce the next piece for our audience to see. The development of the Far East region of Russia has been a key issue for this year's forum. Russia has been pushing for, as our guests mentioned earlier many times, Far East development for years, and China has been actively taking part in some of those developments. So far, China is the largest foreign investor in the Far East region. 28 projects covering multiple areas are in progress. Total investment reached nearly $4 billion. So you can see some of those numbers over there, as mentioned by our guests earlier. But Professor Liu, one thing is very important. That is whether this forum or that forum, of course, it's Russia government's motivation to promote a more Russian economy and interaction with the rest of the world. But also important is the sustainability of this kind of cooperation, the real implementation of these kind of cooperation, and also the mutual benefits of this kind of cooperation. Professor Liu, very briefly.
Yes, I think now the reality is there that there is high complementarity between these two economies, and also more of the Chinese investors are ready with money, with skill, and now the Russia, when the economy is getting more on the upward movement, and when they are shifting to the Far East, so that's a huge opportunity. And also China is also ready to work with other countries like South Korea, like the Japan, etc., to further develop there. Again, I should say the most important consideration is still the policy consistency and rule of law.
Right. If you take a look at the screen, you will notice in a moment that the numbers between China and Russia when it comes to bilateral trade is certainly getting ever more impressive. If we could play those numbers for our audience right now. But on the other hand, Professor Lukin, what about China and Russia interacting with the other players in the region? Will this region be one of those most active ones when it comes to economic incentives and the economic engines? That is still a big question mark.
Well, Russia is developing relations with other countries, especially economic relations with other countries of the region. You know that President Putin has quite rather close relations with Japanese Prime Minister Abe, and they are talking about, just today they were talking about the possibility of signing a peace treaty, and Russia is cooperating with South Korea very closely. It's cooperating with China and South Korea on the Korean nuclear issue, but South Korea is also a large investor in the Russian Far East. Actually, President Putin is very active in organizing the Vladivostok Forum, and we expected Chinese leader to come there earlier. Of course, they meet with President Putin on many occasions every year, like 5 or 6 times.
Right.
But before this year, Mr. Abe came twice to this forum. I think South Korean leaders came. So some of our skeptical observers asked several times, so where is your good friend China? So we're very happy to see Mr. Xi Jinping this time, or Chairman Xi Jinping this time in Vladivostok. China is also developing relations with neighboring countries, but I think it should probably do more, because if China has some problems with neighboring countries like India, some countries of ASEAN, territorial issues, until these issues are solved, like China managed to solve it with Russia. Until that time, the United States is going to use such conflicts in their favor.
Okay,
so
well,
I think
we have to give the Chinese guests a chance to talk as well. Professor Liu, before we go, very briefly, final comments, response to your colleagues from Russia, two of them.
Yeah, I think there is a huge opportunity, particularly the Belt and Road program is a starting point for a new height in the collaboration, and was not only in agriculture, border trade, but also high-tech development. There can be a lot of promise that can really unfold for the regional integration, not only between these two countries, but also for the entire region.
Not to mention the forum, there's also the joint military exercise, one of the largest of its kind since the 1980s, going on between Russia, China, and Mongolia. Of course, tomorrow we're going to discuss exactly what is happening over there and what does it mean for these countries and these regions. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for today. Mr. Victor Olevich, Mr. Alexander Lukin, and Professor Liu Baocheng. Really appreciate it.